So there's a lot of hype going on the internet about the newest buzzword, which is low center of gravity build. Is a low center of gravity build for everybody? I'm not so sure. So let's take a look at a low center of gravity build, and let's see about some of its shortcomings and some of its advantages. Advantages. Yes, a lower center of gravity build, you have to do less modifications to the steering. You have to do less modifications to the suspension. You're doing more body mods primarily first than you are anything else. Believe it or not, despite all the hype on the internet, they do have their limitations. So first, let's take a look at some of the pros of a low center of gravity build. First and most obvious, road manners. It's going to be more stable. It's going to be closer to the factory suspension geometry, which is obviously going to make it more stable when you're on the street. Second, and something that's kind of obvious, it's going to be easier to get in and out of the vehicle than it is with something that's lifted way up. You know, when you're having to climb in something that's way up here, you're going to appreciate a low center of gravity. I'll give you that one. And you're going to have to make a lot less modifications to the steering because you're not going way up and altering the factory suspension geometry. Another thing that's a big plus, reduced rollover risk. You get off camber with something that's lifted way up, obviously you've got a taller center of gravity. You're going to have to go wider to keep it stable. And typically you can do a low center of gravity build for a whole lot less money than you can with lift and all the suspension modifications that are required to go high. Now let's take a look at some of the downside of a low center of gravity build. A low center of gravity build, your breakover angle is going to greatly be affected. It's not going to be as good as what you might need. Your entry angle is also going to be diminished. As well as your departure angle. Oh! Now let's compare this to a high center of gravity build. High center of gravity build, you're going to obviously have a harder time getting in and out of the vehicle. They're more expensive. There's more rollover risk. There's more cost. However, where you're going to gain is going to be in your departure angle, in your breakover angle, in your entry angle. You're going to have much greater suspension travel, and you can run much bigger tires. Now let's take a look at some of the cons of a high center of gravity. Of course, it's not going to have the same street manners, not without doing a whole lot of suspension work. Lots of things are going to suffer with a high lift build. However, they are correctable with enough parts, with enough engineering, and with enough money. Obviously, a high center of gravity is going to be more prone to rollover, so you have to drive it with more caution. But there's already warnings on your sun visor about that, even on a stock vehicle. And another thing on a high center of gravity lift, you're going to have to do quite a bit to it to correct your drive shaft angles, because you can't just throw a big old lift on it. Expect for your drive shafts not to bind, because as you go up, your drive shaft needs to get longer. The angles change. Your pinion angles have to change. There's a lot of things that have to be changed. So which is better? A high center of gravity or a low center of gravity? Well, to be quite honest, that really depends on where you live and what kind of wheeling you do. You know, most of the people that I see preaching these low center of gravity lifts, I see them doing desert stuff where they're like sliding their Jeep, drifting around, you know, dirt roads on corners. You'd never do that in a high center of gravity vehicle. That'd just be dumb. You're flirting with disaster. Sounds like an old Molly Hatchet song. So for instance, if you're in an area like we're in, you don't have that luxury. You're not sliding around corners in the sand You're crawling on rocks, big rocks. And a low center of gravity vehicle, because make no mistake about it, at this point, the Mistress is a low center of gravity vehicle. And let's take a look at some of her limitations. Up travel. We have a total of 4 inches of up travel, and we still make fender contact.
Okay, your passenger is gonna drop first.
One of the characteristics of a low center of gravity build is you have much more suspension droop. You don't have equal up travel and down travel. Your down travel is where you pick up most of your gains as far as your articulation. I want to use this TJ as an example. Now we're running 3 inches of body lift. If we were still on the stock body mounts, we would be down 3 inches, which would effectively limit our up travel at the tire to only 5 inches. That's not a lot of travel. We've also modified the Mistress in such a manner that we have an extra 3 inches of ground clearance. And we're on 35-inch tires, which is pretty big for a TJ that's still actually running stock suspension geometry. And one of the biggest things on a low center of gravity build, we have one obstacle that's been our nemesis now. We've tried several times to get up it, and on our latest video with the Genrite crew, well, we slid right up the frame, and when we hit this, we did a wheel stand. We had plenty of power, we just didn't have enough height to clear and get the Jeep to power through. And no amount of bumping it, because the shape of that ledge, it was like running into a brick wall. One recent video that sparked my attention referred to high lift, big tire builds as a passing fad whose time has come and gone. Well, I'm here to tell you, as someone who is living with a low center of gravity build, that the shortcomings of a low center of gravity build, no pun intended, far outweigh the cost and the headaches with going high, big tires, and wide. So for those people who think that the big tire, high lift builds are a passing fad, all I have to say is, you do you, boo-boo, because as we continue to reinvent the Dirty Mistress, we're going higher, we're going with a wider stance, and we're going with much larger tires. Because the terrain we drive, a low center of gravity build, just doesn't really cut it. So as you move forward with the build on your rig, keep in mind things like the percentage of on-road versus off-road use, the type of terrain most prevalent in your area and where you're going to be wheeling it the most, the difficulty of the terrain that you'd like to conquer, and the cost and the amount of headaches that it's going to take to get the rig built to where you want to be. And consider all these things before you choose between a high center of gravity and a low center of gravity. And remember, if you're going high, you also need to go wide, because a wider stance is more difficult to roll over and will compensate for that higher center of gravity. We hope we've earned your subscription today. We would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and check out more of our videos. Remember, Jeep, let's explore every path.